Just finished a run, time to head inside and record chapter 2 of the video for the book, Dare to Ask God Questions. Questions for God and questions about God. Today's chapter, Is God Good? All the time? Makes me think of a couple I met with in a very unexpected situation. They had gone through something no couple should ever have to go through. And I remember the father saying to me, maybe God's definition of good is different than ours. Maybe. If it is, what is it? We'll dive into chapter 2 of Dare to Ask God Questions in just a moment.
If you've been around church much, you've likely heard the statement, God answers all prayers. Sometimes his answer is yes. Sometimes his answer is no. Sometimes his answer is not yet. Although I believe that, I also believe there is more to it. And that hits hard as I continue to dig into Habakkuk. While I believe God answers all prayers, I believe sometimes his answer is, do you trust me if my answer is yes? Or, do you trust me if my answer is no? Or, do you trust me if my answer is not yet? More succinctly, though often uncomfortably, God says, do you trust me? And not just in general terms. Do you trust me with this? Whatever the this is for you at this point in your story. In my case, I was 58 as I wrote this chapter, and I was without a personal source of income for the first time since I was 12 years old. Mercifully, my wife has a job she loves as a home healthcare nurse. But it's one thing to say I trust God generically. It's a whole other matter to say I trust him with my unemployment and our finances, in Los Angeles, no less. By the way, if you listened to the previous video in this series, you may have noticed I pronounced it Habakkuk, yet I just said Habakkuk. As I'm constantly learning about his story, last week I learned Habakkuk is closer to the original pronunciation. As we've seen, Habakkuk hit God with a barrage of questions and complaints at the start of this diary entry. Why do you allow violence and lawlessness, crime and cruelty to spread everywhere? People are stealing things and hurting others. They're arguing and fighting. Criminals crowd out honest people and twist the laws around. Evil people gain while good people lose. The judges no longer make fair decisions. It seems his trust in God was being challenged at multiple specific levels, and although he unloaded it on God 2,600 years ago, it looks like he could have been reading today's news. Habakkuk was looking around his town, his nation, and the world, and he was confused and frustrated, and at least a little angry, in general and with God. As we look at how God responded, I hope you notice how God did not respond. God did not turn Habakkuk into a pile of ashes with a lightning bolt for talking to him that way. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations. Look and be amazed, for I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it." The original words for "look around at the nations" were in the command form. God was being quite adamant in telling him to look around. At first glance, that can seem odd because Habakkuk had been looking around. That was at the heart of his problem. He was tired of what he saw, and he didn't understand why God wasn't doing anything about it. In response, God challenged him to look closer, to strain to truly see. There's a difference between seeing words on one of the well-worn pages of an old Bible and coming to understand something about them like never before and excitedly exclaiming, "Oh, now I see." Beyond that, God wasn't talking only to Habakkuk in verse 5. It's hard to see in English, but God was subtly introducing one of the harsh realities that came with being one of his prophets. The words for "look," "in your own day," and "told you about it" were in the plural form. Even though Habakkuk had been the one who got so brutally honest with God, God's reply was in the plural form. He was speaking to Habakkuk, but what he was saying was for all the Israelites. Sharing communication from God to people was at the top of the job description for an Old Testament prophet. If God were to tell you, "Look around, be amazed, I'm doing something you would not believe," would you be excited or concerned? Many people pull a verse like that out of context and twist it into a flowery promise for an inspirational card or a coffee mug. Many people do that with something God said to the prophet Jeremiah. "I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." Most people miss the verse before that, where God said his plans for them included 70 hard years in exile in Babylon. That meant most of them died while there. Many suffered, were mistreated, and were brutally overworked. God said all that was part of his plan. Another well-used but misused Bible verse comes to mind. It's the one where God told King Solomon, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land." Humble themselves was originally in the ongoing passive tense, so it was more like being humbled. It implies having something or someone humbling us. That is drastically different from trying to grit our spiritual teeth and trying to humble ourselves. In the ancient world, the word would have created a picture of someone kneeling in submission. It was also used in wrestling. When someone was ready to surrender in a match, he would say the equivalent of humbled. As uncomfortable as it is to admit, God was behind the humbling referred to in 2 Chronicles 7. That gets even more awkward if you ponder the verse leading into it. I doubt you'll ever see a cross-stitched wall hanging with this from God, especially not with the emphasis I added. If I, that's God, shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locust swarms to eat up all your crops, or if I send an epidemic among you. Wait, what? Could God do that? Would God do that? Well, God seemed to be making it quite clear he could, and the Bible records several times when he did those kinds of things. That means in verse 14, God was saying, if I, or when I, do any of those things, the proper response of my people will be to allow themselves to be humbled, to pray, to seek my face, and to turn from their wicked ways. If my people will turn from their wicked ways. In the Bible, the word wicked refers not only to serial rapists and suicide bombers at children's hospitals. One of my go-to Hebrew scholars says wicked can include misusing or abusing something God's given you, being envious of someone, or being greedy for more of what you already have. See, God did not say his people were to do the praying and all those wicked people needed to get their lives together. God's people were walking down paths they never should have. They needed to realize what he thought and felt about it. It would be easier to be critical of the Israelites if we never lost our temper or grumbled or never had a nasty thought, including in the minutes after a church service. God told them they were to pray, to seek, and to turn to him immediately after they did those very things, and they did them very passionately. See, they had just wrapped up an intense 2-week-long worship service to celebrate the completion of the temple, and that included the sacrifices of 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. And the embers of the sacrificial fires would have still been warm when God gave Solomon what we have in verse 14. God was not talking about a one-and-done deal in 2 Chronicles 7. All the verbs in verse 14, the praying, the seeking, the turning, the being humbled, were in the ongoing sense. God was telling them to make it part of the rhythm of their lives and to keep the rhythm of it moving forward. Now, just like 2 Chronicles 7:14 and Jeremiah 29:11, Habakkuk 1:5 illustrates how important it is to learn the context of Bible verses, to follow the flow of where they've come from and where they go, rather than trying to make them say what we want. God charged Habakkuk to tell the Israelites something was coming and it would blow them away. Look and be amazed. You will be astounded at what I am about to do. I wonder what people raised on modern commercialized Christianity would think was coming if God were to say that to them. I doubt many would guess correctly. God told Habakkuk to tell the Israelites, I am raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. Where that Bible version has Babylonians, others say Chaldeans. Chaldeans were from the southern part of Babylon. At that point in history, all of Babylon was becoming bigger and stronger and more violent than all the other world powers combined, yet God was going to raise them even higher. I can't think of anything that would have stunned Habakkuk more. After crying out to God about the pain, the violence, and the evil in Israel, God told him the Babylonians were about to sweep over them like nothing they had ever seen. That would be like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or the Taliban sweeping across Florida with God behind them. And I hear the echo of the core question from God I posed earlier. Do you trust me with this? If you've been around this faith in God thing for at least a couple of years, would you say genuine trust in God grows in some of the hardest places on the planet and shrinks in places where life seems the easiest? If your answer is yes, slow down and think about the implications if hard times can show God's hand in things as much as good times do. Many people miss the fact that even if someone could learn to trust God perfectly and constantly, it would not keep hard things from happening. Jesus made one of his most uncomfortable promises when he told his first followers, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. Not believing in God does not keep hard things from happening. And many people who say they do not believe in God often react most vocally and negatively against him when hard times come. The God Habakkuk was talking to offers to be with people in hard times. That brings great comfort to some people. Others ask why they would want to be with the one who caused the hard thing or could have stopped it from happening. Being open to being humbled includes admitting we don't know as much as God. Habakkuk was learning the beauty of God's promise to be with us, especially when our emotions are in chaos or we have hard questions for him. Some things that happen in the natural world are so hard that the only way we will have any hope of getting through them or growing because of them is if something supernatural is going on. Having the Holy Spirit working in us is often the only way we can genuinely answer yes when God asks, "Do you trust me with this?" That's the only way I can explain Habakkuk reaching the conclusions he did in his conversation with God about some of the most brutal realities of life. Now, as I was writing that, a Bible verse grew louder in my mind and eventually refused to be ignored. It is one of the most misunderstood and even misused verses in the Bible. It's Romans 8:28, which most English Bibles put in some form of "all things work together for good." We must be careful not to twist what Paul meant in that verse. Some versions say, "all things work together for my good." There are even songs that emphasize that. But there is no form of anything like the word "my" in Paul's original line. All things means all things, not just things in my microscopic dot in the eternal story. But Romans 8:28 is often made to look dangerously self-centered, as in all things that happen to me or around me will work together for my good or good that I will eventually see. I cannot say this strongly enough. Something hard in your life may work out well for you before your life ends. But Romans 8:28 does not promise that. The word for good in verse 28 meant more than what would be considered good today. Given the context, it seems Paul was referring to something we cannot fully know here between Eden and heaven. The way he used the word there gave it a sense of complete and final good, as in how it will be when human history ends, and all things will begin to be seen, known, and understood by those who will be with God in the next stage of eternity. Bear with me for a little more grammar. The word that was originally in Romans 8:28 for all things was plural. However, the verb for work was written in the singular form. That means this is not about all things working together. That makes them sound random and uncoordinated. It was more fully like all things are being worked together. A little later it adds, by God. All things are worked together by God. Now, the average human adult brain weighs about 3 pounds. As remarkable as the brain is, I surrender my obvious limitations when it comes to trying to comprehend God, especially in that part of Romans 8:28. Depending on who you believe, Earth is between 6,000 and 4 billion years old. Some estimates show that 100 billion people have lived on Earth, regardless of its age. Romans 8:28 says, every person's life And everything surrounding each of us has been and is being worked together by God. God designed and God created it all. And he brought precise order and rhythm to it. He orchestrates it all, including when his design included an exceedingly wicked nation rolling across Israel. And Habakkuk was left scratching his head when God first told him that part of the design. And that makes me think of Jim. When I was in my mid-20s and what some people call a baby believer, I found myself at the kitchen table on a farm in Canada with the mother and father of a dynamic young lady I had met the previous spring. Amber and I had been part of a tree planting crew in the mountains of northwestern Canada. She was one of 4 from our team who were swept away and killed when their van plunged into a raging river when a bridge was obliterated by torrential rain. It was the first time I had faced death since finding what my Bible told me was new life in Jesus. The end of life of 4 college-age people triggered a lot of questions from me, and I wasn't satisfied with most of the responses I was getting. A year later, I shared that with Amber's parents. They believed in God, Jesus, and the Bible, and even though they were still grieving intensely, it seemed to be genuinely helpful for them to hear about how much Amber had enjoyed being up in the bush, despite, or maybe because of, how brutally hard it was. Her dad began talking about how they were trying to personalize Romans 8:28. And when he said it, it seemed like a lot more than just some line he had memorized. It sounded more like a truth burning deep inside him, or that he wanted to burn deep inside of him. He half whispered, We know in all things God works for the good. And then he stopped as waves of emotions washed over him. I sensed his entire being struggling to make sense of that line in light of their brutal encounter with one of the all things God was supposedly working. Finally, he found enough composure to continue, and as he looked at his wife, he said, "This still doesn't seem good to us. God must have a different definition of good than we do." That's what I had been thinking for the previous year, but I had never heard anyone say it out loud. Jim's words have played a big part in me learning that Romans 8:28 is not saying all things are good. At least not how we typically think of the word. We'll see that in later chapters. Some things are bad, sometimes ugly, brutal, hard. Some of the best people die the most hideous deaths. Now, back to Habakkuk. He was experiencing extremely hard things. Where we are in his story, God told him things were going to get worse, and then spent some time describing the Babylonians with parts of what it would be like as they rolled through. Babylonians, fierce and ferocious, world-conquering Babylon, grabbing up nations right and left. A dreadful and terrible people, making up its own rules as it goes. Their horses run like the wind, attacking like bloodthirsty wolves. A stampede of galloping horses thunders out of nowhere. They descend like vultures circling in on carrion. They're out to kill. Death is on their minds. They collect victims like squirrels gathering nuts. They mock kings, poke fun at generals, spit on forts, and leave them in the dust. I can't help but notice what God did not say. He did not tell Habakkuk, but since you all had that long, amazing worship service, I'll spare you all of this. No, God acknowledged how evil the Babylonians were. And he even admitted to Habakkuk that they, the Babylonians, are deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God. But rather than stopping them, God said he was going to strengthen them so they could be even more cruel and violent, at least for a while. And that leaves the question from God echoing from the start of this chapter. Do you trust me with this? Chapter 3, next time.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way where the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. Dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning, either way I won't bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding what power set me free, there is a grave that holds nobody, and now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, 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 and I can see the in the darkness, as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens, as the space between wears thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us, as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. this reckoning. I know I will never be alone. I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire, standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me, I'll count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. There is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, there is another.